Hello everybody, welcome to my channel. I'm Nathan and I'm a landscape photographer from Brisbane. If you're new to my channel, this is going to be a bit of an odd video, not something I normally do, but welcome. And if you've been before, then thank you, I really appreciate it. So today's video, why it's going to be a bit different, is I'm going to try and do a bit of a review. I don't do a lot of gear reviews and I don't plan to do a lot moving forward. I just thought that this here camera is interesting enough to warrant a bit of a review on. So what is this camera? Some of you may be asking. I have used it in a couple of videos and I do really enjoy using it. This is a film camera. It is my Fujifilm G617 Professional panoramic camera. So what that means is each frame of film is 6 by 17 centimeters in size. So very, very near a 1:3 ratio panorama. Why do I have this camera? Well, you've probably realized if you're a regular here that I do like shooting panoramas anyway. And I've always wanted one of these. I've always thought they're amazing cameras, and just to be able to shoot a 6:17 panorama in a single frame is just been a dream of mine for quite a while. Because you can run into difficulties doing panoramas digitally. Obviously you usually would tip the camera up on its side and shoot a series of images and stitch them together in Photoshop. Works well, I do it often, but you've got to be very careful with your exposure. Obviously you shoot everything on manual, manual shutter, manual ISO, manual aperture, white balance, even just fixed, usually to daytime for me, but as long as it's fixed so it doesn't change between frames. But the difficulty you can occasionally run into is when the light is changing very rapidly, that can make your frames not quite line up with the same exposure. And if you can do it all in one frame like this, no problem. Where did I get this camera? Well, I actually got it at a pawn shop. A good friend of mine, Brad, saw it there and thought about buying himself, but he knew that I'd wanted one for quite some time, that I would love it. So he tipped me off and off I went in. I negotiated in exchange for a couple of lenses and some cash and walked away with what I thought was a pretty good deal for me, with one of my absolute dream cameras. Do I use this camera regularly? I sure do. I like to take it out as often as I can. It's not a camera you can use in every situation. It is quite a niche camera, but I do use it as much as I can because I still, even when I have my digital camera, I shoot panoramas a lot. So if I can take this out instead, or with the digital camera as well, it's just a lot of fun to use. Now this camera has quite a wide field of view. It has a 105mm f8 lens. It's basically a large format lens because it needs to cover essentially the same sort of frame size as what a 5:7 large format would, just not the full 5 inches. 6 centimeters is like 2¼ inches. So it sort of gives a perspective, I guess, similar in a way to around about 28mm on a full frame, except much narrower. I really like the 105mm lens, and I find while it is quite a wide angle, because it's 110mm medium format, you can still get a little bit of compression with your background anyway. It just doesn't get zoomed right in. So it's really nice. The lens is super, super sharp. I can't say if it's sharp at f8. I've never shot it at f8, but I imagine it is. I usually shoot it stopped down to, well, no larger than f22 usually, but quite often at f35 or its minimum aperture of f45. Shooting it at those apertures, it's still exceptionally sharp. One thing a lot of people online have said is that you really need to use a center neutral density filter with it because it can get a bit of vignetting in the corners if you don't. Honestly, my camera didn't come with one, but it's never vignetted for me. I think perhaps if you're at f8, maybe f11, you would probably get some vignetting, but at the apertures I shoot at, I've never ever had any. So I don't really think that seems to be as much of a problem as people on the internet say it is, but something to keep in mind if you're thinking about getting one of these and you want to shoot it at its larger aperture. There are certainly times where I've sort of thought of a few times where I might like to do that, shoot it at its largest aperture. I just haven't had the opportunity yet. In terms of using the camera, it really is quite a simple camera to use. There's not much to it. It is a little bit different to a lot of sort of 35mm and medium format cameras. Not all, but some, in a sense that winding the film and cocking the shutter are two very separate functions, because it has a leaf shutter in the lens, like many large format cameras, or some of your interchangeable lens medium format cameras like Mamiya 6.7 cameras and Hasselblads. Those you don't have to, well, at least my Hasselblad, you don't have to cock the shutter on the lens each time you fire it. I'm not sure on the Mamiya, I've never used one, but this one, you wind here just like any normal camera, but you've got to cock the shutter with this lever here before you can take a shot. So the camera doesn't have a really fast top shutter speed like a lot of modern cameras does. It is limited to 1/500th of a second is its fastest shutter speed. However, with a camera like this where you're shooting at small apertures, that's not realistically going to cause too many dramas, I shouldn't think. And you can use neutral density filters on the camera. You have to be a little bit careful that because it's quite wide, it's quite easy to get things inside the frame. But I found that using my Koken M series, or often called P series filters, which are the 84-85mm square ones, if I use a single filter holder rather than the 3 filter holder, it doesn't intrude on the frame at all. Whereas I'm quite certain that if I use the 3 filter holder, it would. So it just limits you to realistically only being able to use 1 filter, be it a full ND or a grad filter, but you'll only be able to use 1. But that can definitely help. If you're finding that 1/500th of a second maximum shutter speed is an issue, you can use a neutral density filter. Now, adjusting the aperture, it doesn't have click, click, click. It doesn't have click stops like most. It's just a sliding scale, f8, and slides all the way down to f45. But you just line it up with the mark where it says, and it's easy to do. The shutter speed dial is just on the front of the lens. It's just bulb, 1/2, quarter, etc., etc. Focusing on this thing is quite simple because it doesn't have a because it's such a wide angle and a relatively slow lens, it doesn't have that much depth of focus. So minimum focus is 3 meters, and then before you hit infinity, you get up to 10 meters, then infinity. I quite often just focus this at infinity because things are usually in the distance. But if I do think I have something in the foreground, it also does have a hyperfocal focusing scale, in which case it has markings for 1.5 to 2 meters. Because if you're at a small aperture, you can get, so if I set it to f45 and hyperfocal, at f45 you've basically got 2 meters to infinity in focus. So it's very simple to focus this camera. I feel like the only time I wouldn't shoot it at either hyperfocal or infinity is if I wanted to do a very particular type of shot with some foreground interest that was close by. It is something I'd like to do, but it's also not something you do very often. So it's got 2 places you can affix a cable release to. One is just up here where it's got a regular shutter release button, and then you just fix that like normal, and then you can wind on. The other, it's got a little place just down here on the lens. You may not be able to see that. I'll get a shot of that where you can screw it in. The camera does have a built-in bubble level as well, just on the top right here. Very, very useful. When you're shooting panoramas that are such wide field, you really do need to have a straight horizon. So I find that that's super useful to have, because even if my tripod spirit level looks spot on, sometimes you put the camera on, it might be a tiny bit off. So this just helps. As you look through the viewfinder, you get a really good view of that. So you can just loosen off the tripod ball head, look through the viewfinder and do minute adjustments to get it nice and level. Now this camera does not have a coupled rangefinder at all. It is kind of like a view camera in a sense that the focusing is not coupled. So this can mean there is some parallax issues. Fujifilm do say that if you're looking straight on through the viewfinder, it's got a little notch at the bottom which lines up with the spirit level notch, that there is basically no parallax error at infinity focus. I've seen online some people don't quite agree with that and feel that if you've got your composition, once you've got it lined up, just move the camera down slightly, because it can cut off the bottom of the frame and give you too much at the top. I've not experienced that too much because I sort of allow for a little bit of that anyway, but that's just one thing to keep in mind with regards to composition. Another thing, speaking of composition, the frame is actually a bit wider than 17 centimeters. I found it's about 18.5, which is actually nice I wonder if if they did that intentionally to allow a bit of room when trying to stitch together scanned files back in the early days, or whether it's just to allow a little bit of cropping for composition adjustment. But it's kind of cool. I have adjusted my composition slightly from that because I always crop down to 6x17. I don't like the uncropped file because I like the 6x17 ratio. So I don't really crop in this way, but just I do adjust a little bit and crop those edges off to get 6x17. Are there any negatives to this camera? Kind of. It's big and heavy. So look at the size of this thing. I believe it weighs 2.5 kilograms. So it's not the heaviest camera out there, but if you're hiking up a mountain, you're taking your camera, you've got your tripod, you've got water, you've got food, you've got your first aid kit, you've got, you know, any warm clothes or wet weather clothes or anything like that, it starts to add up. So it is a bit of a pain to lug around sometimes. Also, the physical size of it, I find, makes it quite difficult sometimes just to fit in my hiking backpack. It basically takes up the whole width of my day pack on its own. So it is a little bit of an inconvenience, not the end of the world, and honestly, if you want to use it, it's worth it, but it's one thing to keep in mind. Another thing, it's not a big deal at all, it's just loading it can be a bit fiddly because there's not a lot of space. I would show you, but I've currently got some film in there, so I can't just open the back, but you've probably seen it in one of my videos before. Just loading it in is just very minimal space where you pull this thing down and get it, then latch it in and pull it across. It's just a bit fiddly. Not a problem at all, just if you're in a hurry, maybe sort of load your film before you go out. I guess now is probably a good time to show you a few of my favorite photos I've taken with it. I haven't taken all that many, I guess. I've probably only put 5 or 6 rolls through it. First roll was a test roll. I didn't really love any of the shots in there, but that's okay. I just was wanting to suss out the camera a little bit and make sure I liked it and just know that I could use it properly before I took it out in the field. And it was a good thing I did that. I did have a bit of a stuff up on one of my first frames on the first roll where I didn't wind on properly. It's happened even since then, so it wasn't foolproof. But I have got some really nice photos. I find it's really nice when you got some mountains or you're just out in the bush and, you know, got some nice rural scenes. One downside apart from that to this camera, you don't have changeable lenses on this. Fuji did, however, do a replacement to this camera afterwards, which instead of the G617 was called the GX617, and it was a changeable lens panoramic camera with the same aspect ratio as this. It had lenses from 90mm, so a bit wider than this, up to I think 300mm was the longest one. But they're considerably more expensive than this, and also they're probably a bit harder to find, particularly with all of the lenses in a set or something like that. So all in all, I don't have any desire to sell this and trade it in, or trade it in for a GX617, but that is one downside. The other downside, I guess, which I mentioned earlier, depending how you look at it, is 4 frames per roll. It is not a lot of shots. And that just means you do, like I mentioned before, you know, you obviously have to think about your shots a bit more carefully to make sure you don't waste film, but you also need to take quite a bit of film with you if you're going somewhere where you think you might have several different composition options. I usually take 2 or 3 rolls with me when I go anywhere with this camera, but I don't usually use them. I'll usually get through maybe 1.5 rolls, because I try not to shoot it too much, because the process of this camera is slow. and it's enjoyable, and you just make sure you plan it out. Realistically, I don't think there's any other downsides to this camera. It's quite expensive to purchase. I just got lucky that I could trade some lenses for it, so I didn't have a huge cash outlay, but it can get expensive. I guess servicing it could be difficult. I'm not sure if there's anyone in Australia that services it. There might be somewhere in Sydney or Melbourne. I haven't sussed it out yet because I haven't needed to. I'm sure there is a place in Japan called Kanto Camera Services, which I would imagine would service it. They service most old film cameras, but it would probably be a fairly expensive exercise to service. Mine doesn't seem to need it at the moment. The shutter speeds all seem to be correct because I've shot slide film with it and got good results. So as long as the shutter's working and the speed's correct, I'm not too concerned about anything else. All in all, I really, really love this camera, and I really hope to be able to show you more of it in upcoming videos because I really do enjoy using it. Otherwise, yeah, I just wanted to introduce you to this camera, to the Fuji G617 Professional, because a lot of people probably haven't heard of it, and those that have probably don't know anyone or too many people with hands-on experience. So I really hope that you've enjoyed this video and hopefully learnt a thing or two about this camera, which has quickly become one of my favorite cameras. If you do have any questions about the camera or any feedback you'd like to leave, please feel free to leave it below. I do really appreciate that. If you like this video, give me a bit of a thumbs up, and please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. Otherwise, I can't wait to see you again soon. My next video will definitely be out in the field like I normally do. Thanks so much, see you later.